Sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we almost miss. Sometimes destiny arrives not with thunder and lightning, but with a whisper so soft it could be mistaken for whine through prairie grass. For Jake Morrison, a weathered rancher who had spent 38 years believing he knew every inch of his family's land and every secret it held, that whisper would shatter everything he thought he understood about his past, his present, and the woman who had just walked back into his life after 20 years of silence. Standing in the doorway of his grandfather's old barn, watching Sarah Chen emerge from a dusty pickup truck with a manila envelope clutched against her chest like armor, Jake had no idea that the next few minutes would rewrite the story of his entire existence. He had no way of knowing that the woman he'd once loved and lost was about to reveal a truth so profound, so life-altering, that his heart would literally skip beats as the words left her lips. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning in rural Montana was about to become the day everything changed forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Morrison ranch as Jake tightened the fence post with practiced efficiency. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air, and his calloused hands moved with the rhythm of a man who had performed the same task thousands of times before. The ranch stretched out before him like a living painting, rolling hills dotted with cattle, the distant mountains standing guard over land that had been in his family for 4 generations. He paused to wipe his brow and survey his domain, the same ritual he'd performed every morning for the past 15 years since taking over operations from his aging father. 3,000 acres of Montana wilderness, prime grazing land, and memories embedded in every fence post and weathered barn board. This was his legacy, his responsibility, and his prison all rolled into one package that he'd never questioned until recently. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made him look toward the main road. A cloud of dust announced an approaching vehicle, unusual for this time of morning when most folks were either at work in town or tending their own spreads. Jake squinted against the sun, trying to make out the make and model of the truck. Visitors were rare on the Morrison ranch, and unexpected ones even rarer. As the vehicle drew closer, he recognized it as a newer Ford pickup, silver with out-of-state plates. His stomach tightened with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Something about the deliberate way the truck navigated the winding dirt road suggested this wasn't someone who had taken a wrong turn or needed directions to the highway. The truck came to a stop near the main house, a 2-story structure built by his great-grandfather in 1892, its white paint showing the honest wear of Montana winters and summers. Jake set down his tools and walked slowly toward the visitor, his boots crunching on the gravel path his grandfather had laid down 60 years ago. The driver's door opened, and Jake's world tilted sideways. Sarah Chen stepped out of the truck with the same graceful movement he remembered from 2 decades ago, though time had refined her features and added confidence to her posture. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore jeans and a blue flannel shirt that made her look like she belonged on a ranch, though Jake knew she'd built a successful career as a veterinarian in California. For a moment, they stood frozen, separated by 20 years and 20 feet of gravel, each taking in the changes time had wrought on the other. Jake's sandy brown hair now showed gray at the temples, and his face carried the lines that came from squinting into prairie sun and weathering financial hardships. Sarah's face had matured beautifully, though he noticed tension around her dark eyes that hadn't been there when they were young and believed the world held unlimited possibilities. "Hello, Jake." Her voice carried the same soft musical quality that had once whispered his name in the darkness of summer nights, but now it held an edge of nervousness that set his already rattled nerves further on edge. "Sarah." He managed her name, though his throat felt like he'd been eating dust for a week. "It's been a long time." She nodded, clutching a manila envelope against her chest like a shield. "Too long, maybe. Or not long enough, depending on how you look at it." They stood in awkward silence, the weight of their shared history and the mystery of her sudden appearance creating a tension thick enough to cut with a fence wire. Jake noticed she kept glancing toward the old barn, the one his grandfather had built for storing hay and equipment, the same barn where he and Sarah had carved their initials into a support beam during the summer before their senior year of high school. "What brings you back to Montana?" Jake finally asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Sarah hadn't left on good terms. Their breakup had been explosive, full of harsh words about dreams and limitations, about her ambitions and his responsibilities. She'd accused him of being too afraid to leave the ranch, and he'd accused her of being too selfish to understand why it mattered. Neither accusation had been entirely wrong.
Sarah's grip tightened on the envelope. "I came to give you something. Something that should have been yours a long time ago." The way she said it made Jake's chest tighten. This wasn't a casual visit or an attempt at rekindling old flames. This was something else entirely, something that had driven her to make the 12-hour drive from Sacramento to the middle of nowhere, Montana, with grim determination written across her features. "What kind of something?" He heard the wariness in his own voice and saw her register it. "The kind that changes everything." She looked past him toward the house, then back to his face. "Is there somewhere private we can talk? This isn't something for the front yard." Jake nodded toward the old barn, irony not lost on him that they'd returned to the place where their love story had begun to end it with whatever revelation she'd driven across 4 states to deliver. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the crisp morning air, both lost in memories of the last time they'd walked this path together. The barn door protested with a rusty squeal as Jake pulled it open. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the weathered wood siding. The smell hit him immediately, a mixture of old hay, leather, and motor oil that transported him back to his childhood, to summer days when this barn had been his fortress, his sanctuary, his escape from the adult worries that even then seemed to press down on the Morrison family like storm clouds. Sarah stepped inside and looked around, her gaze settling on the beam where their initials were still visible, carved deep enough to survive decades of harsh weather and harder memories. "Some things never change. Some things do." Jake's response came out sharper than he intended. "You changed. You left." She turned to face him, and he saw something in her expression that made his stomach drop. It was the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. "That's why I'm here, Jake. That's what I need to tell you." She opened the envelope with careful, deliberate movements, as if the contents might explode if handled roughly. From inside, she withdrew a collection of papers, some official-looking documents, and what appeared to be a handwritten letter in faded ink. "Do you remember the night before I left for college?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's jaw tightened. Of course he remembered. It was the night that had haunted his dreams for 20 years, the night they'd made love in this very barn while rain drummed on the roof overhead, both of them crying as they held each other, knowing it was goodbye even though they'd promised to make it work, promised to find a way to bridge the gap between her dreams and his responsibilities. "I remember," he said simply. Sarah's hands were shaking now, and Jake noticed she was having trouble meeting his eyes. "There's something I never told you about that night. Something I should have told you before I left, but I was scared and young and I thought I was protecting both of us." The bottom of Jake's stomach dropped out. He'd lived through enough difficult moments to recognize when his life was about to change course, and this moment had all the hallmarks of a before and after that would divide his existence into what he knew before and what he'd have to live with after. "Sarah, what are you trying to tell me?" She looked up at him then, and he saw tears threatening to spill over. 6 weeks after I left for Stanford, I found out I was pregnant." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His vision blurred momentarily, and he felt his heart skip several beats as the meaning of her words sank in. Pregnant. 6 weeks after she left. Which meant the baby would have been conceived that last night in the barn, conceived in love and desperation and farewell. What happened to the baby? His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, hoarse and strained. Sarah's hands trembled as she held out the papers. "She didn't die, Jake. She grew up. She graduated from high school last spring with honors. She's starting her first semester at Montana State University next month, and she's been asking questions about her father for the past 2 years." The barn seemed to spin around Jake as the full impact of her revelation crashed over him. He had a daughter. A daughter who was now 18 years old, who had lived her entire life without knowing him, who was about to attend college just 3 hours away from the ranch where he'd spent nearly 4 decades thinking he'd die alone and childless. "Her name is Emma," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger now that the secret was finally out. "Emma Morrison Chen. I gave her your name, even though I never told you about her. She has your eyes and your stubborn streak and your way of singing off-key when she thinks nobody's listening." Jake's legs felt unsteady, and he leaned against the same beam where they'd once carved their initials. The wood was cool against his back,
grounding him in the moment even as his entire understanding of his life crumbled and reformed itself around this new reality.
"Why now?" he managed to ask. "Why are you telling me this now, after 18 years?
Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded him powerfully of the 18-year-old girl who'd broken his heart in this same barn 20 years ago.
"Because she's going to find you anyway. She's been doing research, building a family tree, asking questions I can't keep deflecting forever. And because I finally realized that keeping this secret wasn't protecting anyone anymore.
It was just hurting all three of us." She held out the papers again, and this time Jake took them with hands that shook despite his efforts to stay steady.
The top document was a birth certificate. Emma Morrison Chen, born March 15, 2008, in Sacramento, California. Father's name listed as Jacob Morrison of Whitefish, Montana.
Below the birth certificate was a collection of photographs spanning 18 years. A tiny baby with unmistakable Morrison features. A toddler with his same stubborn cowlick. A little girl missing her front teeth and grinning at the camera with his exact smile. A gangly teenager in a graduation cap and gown, her face a perfect blend of his features and Sarah's, her expression carrying the intelligence and determination that had driven Sarah away from Montana and, apparently, back to it. The last document in the stack was a handwritten letter addressed to "My father, whoever you are." Jake's vision blurred as he read the careful cursive writing of a teenage girl who had inherited his way with words and Sarah's careful penmanship. "I don't know your name or where you live or what you do for work, but I know you exist somewhere, and I think about you every day. Mom says you were a good man who loved her very much, but that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the different directions two people need to go in life. She says you would have been a wonderful father if circumstances had been different, but I want you to know that circumstances could still be different if you wanted them to be. I'm going to college in Montana this fall, and I keep hoping that maybe I'll run into you somewhere, maybe at a coffee shop or a gas station, and somehow we'll recognize each other. I know that's probably impossible, but I wanted you to know that if you're out there looking for me too, I'm looking for you back." Jake's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the letter. 20 years of wondering what might have been, 20 years of thinking he'd lost his only chance at love and family, and now this. A daughter who had been searching for him while he'd been mourning a future he'd never known existed. "She's beautiful," he whispered, looking again at the graduation photo. "She looks like you, but she has your eyes. And your nose. And your absolutely terrible taste in music." Sarah's voice was soft, almost fond. "She loves country music and horses, and she wants to study agriculture with a focus on sustainable ranching practices." Jake looked up sharply.
"Ranching?"
Sarah nodded. "She's been fascinated by ranch life since she was little. I think it might be genetic. She's been volunteering at a therapeutic writing center since she was 14, and she talks about wanting to start her own operation someday that combines traditional ranching with environmental conservation." The irony was so profound it was almost painful. His daughter, raised without any knowledge of her heritage, had independently developed a love for the very life he'd been born into, the life that had created the divide between him and her mother in the first place.
"Does she know you're here?"
Jake asked. Sarah shook her head. "I wanted to talk to you first. To give you the choice about whether you want to meet her. I know this is a shock, Jake. I know you have every right to be angry with me for keeping this from you for so long." Jake looked at the photographs again, trying to reconcile the reality of having a daughter with the careful, solitary life he'd built for himself over the past 20 years. The ranch had been his whole world, his only legacy, and now suddenly, he had a living, breathing legacy in the form of a young woman who shared his blood and, apparently, his dreams as well.
"Angry doesn't begin to cover it," he said quietly.
"But right now I'm too stunned to figure out what I'm feeling." The barn fell silent except for the soft sound of wine through the gaps in the siding. Jake stared at the birth certificate, at his own name printed in official black ink next to a date that marked the beginning of a life he'd never known existed.
Emma Morrison Chen. His daughter. His daughter.
The words kept circling in his mind like horses in a corral, familiar but impossible to fully grasp. He was a father. He had been a father for 18 years without knowing it. Somewhere in California, a young woman with his eyes and his love for the land had grown up creating a mental image of the father she'd never met, just as he'd been creating a mental image of the children he'd never had. "What happens now?" he asked, looking up at Sarah for the first time since she'd begun her revelation. Sarah's expression was hopeful but guarded. "That's up to you. She's planning to come to Bozeman for orientation next week. If you want to meet her, I could arrange for her to come here first. Or you could meet her on neutral ground. Or if you need more time to process all this, I could tell her I found you but that you need some space to adjust to the idea." Jake looked around the barn that held so many memories, his gaze settling again on their carved initials. 20 years ago, they'd said goodbye in this place, both of them believing they were ending their story. But, standing here now with proof of their daughter's existence in his hands, he realized their story had never really ended. It had just been waiting for the right moment to begin its next chapter. Outside, he could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the familiar sounds of the ranch that had defined his entire life. But, for the first time in decades, those sounds felt like a beginning rather than a burden, like a legacy worth sharing rather than a responsibility to bear alone. His daughter wanted to study sustainable ranching. His daughter loved horses and country music. His daughter had been looking for him while he'd been living with an emptiness he'd never been able to name. Jake looked at Sarah and saw the girl he'd loved and the woman she'd become and the mother of his child he'd never known existed all layered together in her face. "I want to meet her," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I want to meet my daughter." The 3 days that followed Sarah's revelation passed like a fever dream for Jake Morrison. He moved through his daily routines with the mechanical precision of a man operating on autopilot while his mind raced through 18 years of missed moments, lost opportunities, and the stunning reality that he was about to meet his daughter for the first time. Sarah had left the ranch that afternoon with a promise to call Emma and arrange a meeting for the weekend. She'd given Jake her cell phone number written on a piece of paper that he'd folded and unfolded so many times it was beginning to wear thin along the creases. The photographs of Emma remained spread across his kitchen table like evidence of a life he'd never lived, and he found himself studying them between cups of coffee that grew cold as he lost track of time. His foreman, Miguel Santos, noticed the change immediately. They'd worked together for 12 years, and Miguel knew Jake's moods better than most people knew their own. During Thursday's morning check of the south pasture, Miguel finally broke the silence that had stretched between them since they'd saddled their horses. "Boss, you're riding like a man with something heavy on his mind," Miguel said, adjusting his weathered hat against the morning sun. "Want to talk about it?" Jake looked across the rolling hills where his cattle grazed peacefully, the same view that had comforted him through every crisis of his adult life. But today it felt different, like he was seeing it through new eyes, imagining how it might look to a young woman who had inherited his love for this land without ever setting foot on it. "You remember when I told you about Sarah Chen?" Jake asked, not taking his eyes off the horizon. Miguel nodded slowly. "The veterinarian you were sweet on back in high school. The one who broke your heart when she left for California. She came to see me on Tuesday." Jake's voice was carefully controlled, but Miguel caught the undercurrent of something significant. "After 20 years? That's either very good news or very bad news." Jake finally turned to look at his friend, this steady man who had become like a brother to him over the years they'd worked side by side. "I have a daughter, Miguel. An 18-year-old daughter I never knew existed." Miguel's horse pranced sideways as his rider processed the shocking news. "Dios mío. Jake, are you certain? Birth certificate. Pictures spanning 18 years. She even has the Morrison cowlick." Jake's attempt at humor fell flat, the magnitude of the situation too overwhelming for levity. They rode in silence for several minutes while Miguel absorbed the information. Finally, he spoke with the careful wisdom that had helped Jake through every major decision of his adult life. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to meet her. This weekend. Sarah's bringing her to the ranch." Jake's voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Miguel, what if she hates me? What if she looks at me and sees nothing but a stranger who abandoned her?" "Did you abandon her?" "I didn't know she existed.
Then, you didn't abandon her. Miguel's logic was simple and unassailable. Jake, you're one of the most decent men I know.
You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone and everything on this ranch.
You think that kind of character just disappears when it comes to your own blood?
Jake wanted to believe his friend's confidence, but the fear that had been growing in his chest since Tuesday threatened to overwhelm him. 18 years of not being there for birthdays, scraped knees, first days of school, bedtime stories, and all the countless small moments that build the foundation of a parent-child relationship.
How did you bridge that kind of gap?
Thursday evening, Jake found himself in the barn again, standing in the same spot where Sarah had shattered his understanding of his own life. He'd come here hoping for clarity, but instead found himself more confused than ever. The letter from Emma was in his shirt pocket, and he'd read it so many times he could recite it from memory. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah.
Emma is excited to meet you. We'll be there Saturday at 2 p.m. if that works for you.
Jake stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "That works. I'm nervous as hell, but that works."
Sarah's response came quickly. She's nervous too.
But, Jake, she's also incredibly excited. She's been planning what to say to you for 2 years.
That night, Jake barely slept.
He lay in his childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling his grandfather had installed 70 years ago, trying to imagine what his daughter might be like. Sarah had given him the basic facts during their conversation in the barn. Emma was an honor student who loved horses and wanted to study sustainable ranching. She volunteered at a therapeutic riding center and had been saving money from her part-time job at a feed store to help pay for college. She played guitar, though not very well, and she had a rescue dog named Ranger who had been her constant companion since she was 12. But facts were just the skeleton of a person. Jake wanted to know if she laughed like Sarah or if she had inherited his tendency to brood.
Did she share his love of early mornings, or was she a night owl like her mother? Was she impulsive or cautious, outgoing or reserved, stubborn or accommodating?
18 years of personality development compressed into a few photographs and a handful of details that only made him hungry for more.
Friday morning brought no relief from his anxiety.
Jake found himself cleaning the house with an intensity that amused Miguel, who stopped by after lunch to find his boss scrubbing baseboards that hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. "She's your daughter, not a home inspector," Miguel observed, accepting the cup of coffee Jake offered him. "She's going to be looking at you, not your housekeeping." "I want everything to be perfect," Jake said, realizing how foolish he sounded even as the words left his mouth. "I want her to see that I've got my life together, that I would have been a good father if I'd had the chance."
"Jake." Miguel's voice was gentle but firm. "You can't prove 18 years of good parenting in one afternoon.
But you can show her who you are right now, today. And who you are as a good man who would have moved mountains for her if he'd known she existed." That evening, Jake called his parents in Arizona, where they'd retired 5 years earlier after finally accepting that their son was capable of running the ranch without their constant supervision. The conversation was difficult, filled with his mother's tears and his father's barely controlled anger at Sarah for keeping such a monumental secret. But underneath their shock, Jake heard excitement at the prospect of meeting their granddaughter. "Bring her down to visit us," his mother insisted through her tears. "I want to show her the photo albums, tell her about her great-grandparents, teach her to make your grandmother's apple pie."
"Let's see how tomorrow goes first, Mom," Jake said.
"She might take one look at me and decide she wants nothing to do with any of us." "That girl has Morrison blood in her veins," his father declared with typical Morrison stubbornness. "She's not going to run from family." Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect Montana day that made Jake proud of his homeland. He dressed carefully in clean jeans, his best boots, and a blue shirt that Sarah had once said brought out his eyes. He made coffee, then poured it out because his hands were shaking too badly to hold the cup steady. He fed the horses, checked the cattle, and found himself back in the kitchen by noon, 2 hours before Sarah and Emma were scheduled to arrive. At exactly 2 o'clock, Jake heard the sound of gravel under tires. He looked out the kitchen window and saw Sarah's silver pickup truck making its way up the long driveway. There was a passenger in the truck, a young woman with long dark hair who was leaning forward in her seat as if trying to take in every detail of the landscape passing by her window. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he walked to the front porch, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. This was it. This was the moment that would divide his life into before and after, the moment he would meet his daughter for the first time. The truck stopped in front of the house, and Sarah got out first. She looked across the yard at Jake and gave him an encouraging nod, then walked around to open the passenger door. Emma Morrison Chen stepped out of the truck and into Jake's life with the same unconscious grace her mother had possessed at 18, but there was something unmistakably Morrison in the way she stood, in the set of her shoulders, in the careful way she assessed her surroundings before moving forward. She was tall for a young woman, probably close to 5'8", with her mother's dark hair and delicate features combined with Jake's strong jawline and deep-set eyes. She was beautiful in a way that took Jake's breath away, but, more than that, she was undeniably his daughter. He would have known her anywhere, would have picked her out of a crowd based on nothing more than the way she held her head and the stubborn tilt of her chin that he recognized from looking in mirrors his entire life. For a moment that lasted forever, father and daughter stared at each other across 20 feet of gravel and 18 years of separation. Emma's hand was pressed against her chest, and Jake realized she was feeling the same overwhelming rush of recognition and emotion that was threatening to buckle his knees. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You have my eyes." Jake laughed, a sound that came out half-sob. "I was going to say you have mine." Emma took a tentative step forward, then another, her confidence growing with each movement. "You're taller than I imagined. I pictured you being shorter for some reason." "You're exactly what I imagined," Jake said honestly. "You're perfect." They met in the middle of the yard, and, for a moment Jake wasn't sure what to do. Did you hug a daughter you'd never met? Did you shake hands? Did you stand there awkwardly making small talk until the moment passed? Emma solved the problem by stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him in a fierce hug that knocked the breath out of his lungs. She was solid and warm and real, and she smelled like her mother's shampoo and something uniquely her own, something that spoke to Jake's heart in a language he'd never known he understood. "I can't believe you're real," Emma said against his shoulder, her voice muffled but clear. "I've thought about this moment so many times, and you're actually real." Jake's arms came up around her automatically, holding his daughter for the first time and possibly not the last, depending on how the rest of this conversation went. "I can't believe you're real either, sweetheart." They stood there holding each other while Sarah watched from beside the truck, her own eyes bright with tears. This was the moment she'd pictured for 18 years but had been too afraid to make happen, the moment when the two most important people in her life finally found each other. When Emma finally stepped back, her face was streaked with tears but her smile was radiant. "Can I see the ranch? Mom told me it's been in your family for generations, and I've been dying to see it ever since she told me about you." "Our family," Jake corrected gently. "It's been in our family for generations. And, yes, absolutely. I want to show you everything." The next 3 hours passed like a dream. Jake walked Emma through every corner of the ranch, from the main house with its collection of Morrison family photos to the barns where 4 generations of his ancestors had stored hay and equipment. He showed her the creek where he'd learned to fish, the pasture where his grandfather had taught him to ride, and the hill where the family cemetery held the graves of great-grandparents she'd never met but whose stubborn determination lived on in her features. Emma absorbed everything with an intensity that reminded Jake powerfully of himself at her age, when he'd first begun to understand that this land was more than just his home, it was his heritage and his responsibility. She asked thoughtful questions about water rights and grazing rotation, about the challenges of maintaining a mid-sized operation in an era of corporate agriculture, about the balance between tradition and innovation that defined modern ranching. "This is what I want to do," Emma said as they stood on the hill overlooking the entire spread, the sun beginning to sink toward the mountains in the distance. "I mean, I want to go to school and learn all the science behind it, but this is what I want my life to look like." Jake felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of completion he hadn't even known he was missing. "There's room here for both tradition and innovation," he said carefully. "Room for someone who understands that land management is both an art and a science." Emma looked at him sharply. "Are you offering me a job?"
I'm offering you a legacy, Jake said simply.
This ranch needs someone who loves it, who understands what it means, who's willing to work for its future instead of just its present.
I've been wondering what would happen to it when I'm gone, but maybe I've been asking the wrong question. What's the right question? Maybe the right question is what happens to it when you're ready to come home. Emma's breath caught, and Jake saw the moment when his words truly sank in. Home.
He was offering her a home, a place to belong, a future built on the foundation of their shared bloodline and their mutual love for this harsh, beautiful land. I don't know anything about ranching, Emma said, though her voice carried hope rather than doubt.
I mean, I know theory from books, but I've never actually done it.
I didn't know anything about being a father until 3 days ago, Jake replied.
But I'm willing to learn if you are.
Sarah, who had been watching this conversation from a respectful distance, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. I think, she said softly, that this might be exactly what all three of us have been looking for without knowing it. As the sun set over the Morrison Ranch that evening, 3 people sat on the front porch sharing stories and building bridges across the gap that 20 years of separation had created. Emma told Jake about her childhood, her dreams, her fears about starting college so far from everything she'd ever known. Jake told Emma about the ranch, about his grandparents who had built this legacy with their bare hands, about the responsibility and joy of caring for something bigger than yourself. And Sarah watched them together, seeing the father Emma had always needed and the daughter Jake had never known he was missing, finally finding each other in the place where their story had begun 2 decades earlier. By the time they said goodnight, Emma had extracted a promise from Jake to visit her at college orientation the following weekend, and Jake had secured Emma's commitment to spend her Christmas break at the ranch, learning the basics of winter livestock management and discovering whether the life she thought she wanted was the life she actually wanted to build. Standing in his doorway as Sarah's truck disappeared into the darkness, Jake felt the fundamental shift in his existence settling into his bones. He was no longer just Jake Morrison, the bachelor rancher who lived alone with his memories and his responsibilities. He was Jake Morrison, father to Emma Morrison Chen, keeper of a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. For the first time in decades, the future felt brighter than the past. The months that followed Emma's first visit to the Morrison Ranch unfolded like chapters in a story Jake had never dared to dream he'd get to live. October brought daily phone calls between father and daughter as Emma navigated her first semester at Montana State University in Bozeman. She called him for advice on everything from choosing classes to dealing with a difficult roommate, and Jake found himself treasuring these conversations more than anything he'd ever experienced. During their first call after she'd been on campus for a week, Emma's voice carried the excitement of someone discovering a new world. "Dad, my animal science professor used to work with sustainable grazing systems in New Zealand. She says there are techniques we could implement on the ranch that would increase our carrying capacity by 20% while actually improving the soil health."
Dad.
The word still stopped Jake's heart every time Emma said it, still felt like a gift he wasn't sure he deserved but was grateful to receive. "Tell me more about these techniques," he said, settling into his kitchen chair with his evening coffee, preparing for what had become his favorite part of each day. Emma's enthusiasm poured through the phone as she described rotational grazing systems, soil restoration techniques, and water management strategies that could transform the way the Morrison Ranch operated. Her passion for the science behind ranching reminded Jake of his grandfather, who had been an innovator in his own time, always looking for ways to improve efficiency while respecting the land that sustained them. "I've been thinking," Emma continued, her voice growing more tentative, "about maybe changing my major from general agriculture to ranch management with a focus on environmental sustainability."
"What do you think?" Jake smiled, though she couldn't see it. "I think you should study whatever makes your heart sing, sweetheart.
The ranch will still be here when you graduate, and it'll be better for having someone who truly understands it taking care of it." Their conversation that evening lasted nearly 2 hours, covering everything from Emma's struggles with calculus to her excitement about joining the university's rodeo team. By the time they said goodnight, Jake felt like he'd been given another precious glimpse into the daughter he was still getting to know, still marveling at the remarkable young woman who had emerged from the love he and Sarah had shared 20 years earlier. November brought Emma's first visit back to the ranch since that initial meeting. She arrived on a Friday evening with a truck full of textbooks and a head full of questions, ready to spend the weekend putting theory into practice. Jake had arranged to take time off from the daily operations, leaving Miguel in charge so he could focus entirely on his daughter. Saturday morning found them in the south pasture before sunrise, checking cattle and discussing the principles of low-stress livestock handling that Emma had been studying in her animal behavior class. She was a natural, Jake realized as he watched her move quietly among the herd, speaking to the animals in the same soft tones he'd inherited from his grandfather. "You've got good instincts," Jake told her as they rode the fence line together, their horses moving easily across terrain that Jake had traveled thousands of times but was seeing anew through Emma's eager eyes. "Better than good. You understand these animals." Emma beamed at the praise, her face glowing with pride and purpose. "It feels like coming home," she said simply. "Like this is what I was meant to do." That afternoon, Jake taught Emma how to repair fence line, a skill that seemed mundane but was absolutely essential to ranch life. Her hands were soft from her academic life, but she attacked the work with determination, ignoring the blisters that formed as she learned to handle the wire and tools. "Why didn't you ever marry?" Emma asked as they worked together, her question coming out of nowhere with the directness that Jake was learning was characteristic of his daughter. Jake paused in his work, considering how to answer. "I suppose I never met anyone who understood this place the way your mother did. And, after she left, I convinced myself that this ranch was enough, that I didn't need anything else." "Were you lonely?" The simple question hit Jake harder than he'd expected. "Yes," he admitted. "Though I didn't let myself think about it very often." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Mom never married either." "She says she's been on some dates over the years, but nothing serious." "I always wondered if she was still in love with you." That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Emma brought up the subject that Jake had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "I want to spend Christmas break here," she said without preamble. "Not just visiting for a few days, but actually working. Learning what it's really like to run this place during the hardest part of the year." Jake felt his heart swell with pride and terror. Winter on the ranch was brutal, demanding, and unforgiving. It was when the romance of ranch life stripped away to reveal the harsh realities underneath. It was also when the true character of a rancher was tested, when determination and grit mattered more than good intentions. "Winter isn't romantic, Emma," Jake warned. "It's getting up at 4 in the morning to check on pregnant cows in sub-zero weather. It's hauling hay through snowdrifts that come up to your waist. It's working in conditions that would send most people running for the nearest heated building." Emma's chin lifted with the stubborn determination Jake recognized from looking in mirrors his entire life. "I'm not most people. I'm a Morrison." The pride in her voice made Jake's chest tight with emotion. "Yes, you are. And if you're sure about this, then we'll make it work. But you'll do the job right, or you'll go back to school early. Deal?" "Deal." December arrived with an early blizzard that tested Emma's resolve before she'd even packed her bags for Christmas break. Jake called her as the storm raged across central Montana, concerned about her driving in dangerous conditions. "I'll be fine," Emma assured him, though he could hear the wind howling through her phone. "I've been practicing driving in snow, and I have good tires and emergency supplies. I'll see you tomorrow evening." True to her word, Emma arrived at the ranch the next day as the storm was clearing, her truck loaded with warm clothes and her determination intact. She stepped out into the frigid air with a grin that reminded Jake of his grandfather facing down his own first Montana winter 70 years earlier. The next 3 weeks tested every ounce of Morrison's stubbornness in Emma's DNA. She learned to break ice on water tanks when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. She hauled hay to cattle that stood like monuments in the snow-covered pastures. She helped deliver calves in a barn that felt barely warmer than the outside air, working by lamplight to bring new life into the harsh beauty of a Montana winter. There were moments when Jake worried he was pushing her too hard, when he saw exhaustion etched into her young features and wondered if he should send her back to the comfortable world of college dormitories and central heating. But Emma never complained, never asked for special treatment, never suggested that the work was too hard or the conditions too harsh. Instead, she threw herself into ranch life with a passion that amazed even Miguel, who had been skeptical about whether a college girl from California could handle the realities of winter ranching. That girl has steel in her backbone, Miguel told Jake after watching Emma work for 2 hours in a howling wind to repair a gate that had been damaged by the cattle. She's going to make a fine rancher if she sticks with it. On Christmas morning, Jake woke to find Emma already in the kitchen making coffee, her hair still messy from sleep but her eyes bright with anticipation. They'd planned a quiet holiday, just the two of them, but the simple pleasure of waking up in his own house with his daughter nearby felt like the greatest gift Jake had ever received. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Emma said, handing him a cup of coffee and a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, Jake found a framed photograph of himself and Emma taken during her November visit, the two of them standing by the fence line with their horses, both of them squinting into the sun and smiling. Below the photograph, Emma had written "Home is where your family is" in her careful handwriting. Jake's gift to Emma was a pair of custom-made boots with her initials burned into the leather, along with something more valuable than any material present could be, a formal partnership agreement making her a joint owner of the Morrison Ranch, effective upon her graduation from college. Emma's hands shook as she read the legal documents. "Dad, I can't accept this. This ranch has been in your family for generations." "You are my family," Jake said simply. "You're the next generation. This ranch needs someone who loves it, someone who understands what it means, someone who's willing to work for its future. That's you, Emma. You're what I've been waiting for my entire life without knowing it." The tears in Emma's eyes reflected the joy and overwhelming gratitude that Jake felt filling his own chest. In less than 4 months, his daughter had gone from being a stranger to being the center of his universe, the reason everything he'd worked for suddenly made sense. Their Christmas celebration was interrupted by an emergency call from a neighboring rancher whose cattle had broken through a fence during the night and were wandering onto the highway. Emma grabbed her coat without hesitation, and father and daughter spent their Christmas morning herding cattle in the snow, working as a team with an efficiency that spoke to their shared DNA and their growing understanding of each other's strengths. "This is the best Christmas I've ever had," Emma said as they rode back toward the house, their horses picking their way carefully through the snow-covered landscape. "Mine too," Jake agreed, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing stories about Christmases past, Emma brought up the subject that Jake had been wondering about but hadn't had the courage to ask. "Have you talked to Mom lately?" Emma asked, her tone carefully neutral. Jake nodded. "She calls every few weeks to check on how you're doing. She's proud of you, sweetheart. Proud of how well you've adapted to ranch life. She's lonely," Emma said quietly. "I can hear it in her voice when she calls. And she asks about you more than she needs to just to check on my welfare." Jake stared into the fire, thinking about Sarah and the complicated emotions that their reunion had stirred up. "Your mother made her choice 20 years ago. She chose her career over this life, and I can't blame her for that. California is where her life is now. But what if her life could be somewhere else?" Emma asked. "What if she's realized that the choice she made 20 years ago doesn't have to be permanent?" The conversation hung in the air between them, full of possibilities and complications that Jake wasn't sure he was ready to explore. Sarah had been the love of his life once, but 20 years was a long time, and they were both different people now. The passion that had burned between them in their youth had been complicated by responsibility, practicality, and the reality that love wasn't always enough to bridge fundamental differences in what two people wanted from life. But, sitting in his childhood home with his daughter beside him, watching the snow fall outside the windows, Jake couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, the story that had begun in that barn 20 years ago wasn't finished yet. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything. Sarah called just after dawn, her voice tight with emotion and purpose. "Jake, I need to tell you something," she said without preamble. "I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few months, watching you and Emma together, seeing how happy she is on the ranch." Jake felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of thinking?" "The kind that's made me realize I might have made a mistake 20 years ago. The kind that's made me wonder if it's too late to fix that mistake." Emma, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with hopeful eyes. Jake looked at his daughter, at the young woman who had brought purpose back into his life, and realized that the gift she'd given him might be even greater than he'd understood. She hadn't just given him a daughter. She might have given him a second chance at the love he'd lost when he was too young and too stubborn to fight for it.
Sarah, Jake said carefully, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying I want to come home, Jake.
If there's still room for me there.
If you think we could try again.
Jake's heart skipped several beats as the words he'd dreamed of hearing for 20 years finally reached his ears. But, this time, he wasn't that heartbroken young man who had loved so desperately and lost so completely. This time, he was a father, a man with responsibilities and priorities that went beyond his own desires. This time, he had Emma to consider. He looked at his daughter, and the radiant smile on her face told him everything he needed to know about what she thought of her mother's proposal. "There's always been room for you here, Sarah," Jake said softly. "The question is whether you really want to fill it."
"I do," Sarah said, her voice strong and sure. "I want to come home."
Sarah's return to Montana in early February felt like watching the past and present collide in ways that were both beautiful and terrifying. She arrived not as the 18-year-old girl who had left with dreams bigger than the big sky country could contain, but as a successful veterinarian with 2 decades of experience, a California practice she was selling, and a heart full of questions about whether some bridges could be rebuilt after 20 years of silence. Jake met her at the small regional airport in Kalispell, standing in the arrivals area with nervous energy radiating from every line of his body. When Sarah emerged from the gate carrying a single suitcase and wearing jeans instead of her usual professional attire, he felt his breath catch the same way it had when he'd first seen her step out of that pickup truck 5 months earlier. But this time was different. This time she wasn't here to deliver shocking news and leave again. This time she was here to stay, to see if the love that had created their daughter could grow into something mature and lasting, something built on understanding rather than passion, on partnership rather than desire alone. "You came," Jake said simply as she approached, his voice carrying wonder and gratitude in equal measure.
"I said I would."
Sarah's smile was nervous but genuine, her eyes searching his face for any sign of regret or hesitation.
"Are you having second thoughts?"
"Every minute since you called," Jake admitted with the honesty that had always been one of his best and worst qualities.
"But not about wanting you here.
About whether I'm the same man you fell in love with, whether this place can be enough for you now when it wasn't enough 20 years ago." Sarah reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that felt both familiar and new.
"I'm not the same woman who left, Jake. And maybe that's exactly what we both needed."
The drive back to the ranch took them through country that had barely changed since Sarah's childhood, past the same landmarks that had marked the boundaries of their teenage world. But everything felt different now, filtered through the lens of accumulated experience and the sobering knowledge that second chances were rare gifts that should never be taken lightly. "Tell me about your practice," Jake said as they navigated the winding mountain roads. "It must have been hard to give up something you spent 20 years building." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the familiar landscape roll past her window. "It was successful, profitable, everything I thought I wanted when I left here. But it wasn't fulfilling anymore. I spent my days treating pampered pets and wealthy people's show horses, and I kept thinking about the working animals here in Montana, the ones who actually need a vet's care but can't always afford it."
"You want to practice here?"
"I want to be useful here," Sarah corrected. "I want to feel like my work matters, like I'm contributing to something bigger than myself. I forgot that feeling in California, but being back here, seeing this land again, remembering what it means to be part of a community where everyone depends on everyone else, it reminded me why I became a veterinarian in the first place." They arrived at the ranch as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold that no photograph could ever capture. Sarah stood beside Jake's truck for a long moment, taking in the view that had been the backdrop of her childhood and teenage years, the view she'd run away from and spent 20 years trying to forget. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered," she said softly.
"Beauty was never the problem," Jake replied.
"The problem was that beauty alone wasn't enough for either of us back then." That evening, as they sat in Jake's kitchen sharing dinner and carefully rebuilding their understanding of each other, Sarah asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds since her phone call. "Where do we start, Jake?
How do we figure out if we can make this work when we couldn't make it work 20 years ago?"
Jake considered the question while studying Sarah's face, noting the lines that time and experience had etched around her eyes, the confidence in her posture that had replaced the restless energy of her youth, the way she looked at him now with assessment rather than assumption. "We start as friends," he said finally. "We start by remembering what we liked about each other before we fell in love, before everything got complicated by expectations and dreams that pointed in different directions."
"And if friendship isn't enough?"
"Then, at least Emma will have both her parents in her life, and maybe that's enough for now." Sarah nodded, accepting the wisdom of his cautious approach even as Jake saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. But they were both older now, both scarred by years of living with the consequences of impulsive decisions made in the heat of young passion. If they were going to build something lasting, it needed to be built on a foundation stronger than desire and more enduring than nostalgia. The next few weeks established a routine that felt both natural and strange. Sarah moved into the guest room in Jake's house, an arrangement that provided proximity without pressure, intimacy without assumptions. During the day, she worked to establish her veterinary practice, treating everything from pregnant cattle to beloved barn cats, quickly earning the trust and respect of ranchers who had been skeptical about accepting a California veterinarian into their insular community. Jake watched her work with the same quiet competence she'd displayed as a teenager, but now tempered with the wisdom and patience that only came with years of experience. She was good at her job, he realized, not just technically proficient but gifted with the kind of intuitive understanding of animals that couldn't be taught in veterinary school. "She's got the touch," Miguel observed after watching Sarah deliver a difficult calf in the middle of a blizzard. "Animals trust her.
That's not something you can fake."
In the evenings, Jake and Sarah fell into a pattern of sharing meals and conversation, catching up on 20 years of separate experiences, carefully mapping the territories of compatibility and difference that would determine whether their renewed relationship could become something real and lasting. Sarah told Jake about the years of building her practice, the relationships that had never quite worked out because no one understood her connection to the land and the animals that had shaped her childhood. She described the growing emptiness she'd felt as her professional success failed to translate into personal fulfillment, the way she'd started dreaming about Montana again after years of convincing herself that California was her true home. Jake shared his own years of quiet loneliness, the way he'd buried himself in ranch work to avoid acknowledging how isolated his life had become, the parade of women who had tried to fill the space Sarah had left but who had never understood that the ranch wasn't just his job, it was his identity. "I think I convinced myself that being alone was noble," Jake admitted one evening as they sat by the fire, the conversation having turned to the choices they'd made and the prices they'd paid for them.
"Like I was being loyal to your memory by refusing to let anyone else into my life."
"That's not loyalty, that's fear," Sarah said gently. "I did the same thing in California, just in a different way. I kept busy, kept moving, kept telling myself that I was building something important. But really I was just running away from the possibility of being hurt again."
"Are you still running?"
Sarah met his eyes directly, her gaze steady and sure.
"No. I'm tired of running.
I'm ready to stand still and see what happens when I stop being afraid." The turning point in their careful courtship came in early March, when a late winter storm trapped them in the house for 3 days with nothing to do but talk, really talk, about the fundamental questions they'd been dancing around since Sarah's return. On the second day of the storm, as they sat in the living room playing cards by lamplight because the power had gone out, Sarah asked the question that cut straight to the heart of their situation.
"Do you love me, Jake? Not the memory of me, not the idea of me, but me as I am now?"
Jake set down his cards and looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the 18-year-old girl who had broken his heart but the 40-year-old woman who had walked away from everything she'd built to take a chance on rebuilding what they'd lost.
"I think I'm falling in love with you," he said honestly. "The woman you are now, not the girl you used to be."
"But, Sarah, I need to know that you're not here because of Emma, or because you're running away from something in California. I need to know that you're here for us, for what we could build together." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she answered. "I'm here because I finally figured out that love isn't about finding someone who fits into the life you've planned.
It's about finding someone you want to plan a life with.
20 years ago, we were trying to make each other fit into lives we'd imagined separately. Now I want to imagine a life together and see if we can make it real." That night, for the first time since Sarah's return, they shared more than conversation and careful friendship. They made love with the tender intensity of two people who had learned the difference between passion and love, between desire and commitment, between the heat of youth and the deeper fire of mature hearts, choosing each other with full knowledge of the costs and complications involved. Afterward, as they lay in Jake's childhood bedroom listening to the wind howl around the house his great-grandfather had built, Sarah asked the question that had been on both their minds since she'd made the decision to come home.
"What do we tell Emma?"
Jake smiled in the darkness, remembering his daughter's radiant expression when she'd overheard Sarah's phone call 3 months earlier.
"I think Emma figured out what we were doing before we did. She's been matchmaking, hasn't she? Shamelessly.
She's been finding excuses to call you whenever she knows I'm within earshot, asking leading questions about whether you miss Montana, whether you think you could be happy here again."
Jake's laughter rumbled in his chest. "I think our daughter is more emotionally intelligent than both of us combined." Our daughter.
Sarah's voice held wonder at the phrase they were both still learning to use.
"I like the sound of that." "So do I."
The storm cleared on the third day, revealing a landscape transformed by fresh snow and the kind of brilliant sunshine that made Montana winters bearable. Jake and Sarah emerged from their enforced intimacy with a new understanding of each other and a cautious optimism about their future that neither had dared to feel just a week earlier. That afternoon, Emma called from college, her voice bright with excitement about her spring semester classes and her growing involvement in the university's sustainable agriculture program. But Jake heard the underlying question in her casual inquiries about how Sarah was settling in, whether she was happy with her decision to move back to Montana. "Your mother and I have been talking," Jake said carefully, catching Sarah's eye across the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. "About what it means to build a life together instead of trying to fit our separate lives into the same space."
"And what have you decided?"
Emma's voice carried hope so profound that Jake felt his chest tighten with emotion.
"We've decided that we're going to try," Jake said simply. "Really try, not just see what happens. We're going to build something together and see if we can make it work."
Emma's whoop of joy was so loud that Sarah could hear it from across the room, and her delighted laughter filled Jake's kitchen like music he'd been waiting his entire life to hear.
"When I come home for spring break, will you both be there?" Emma asked when she'd recovered her composure.
Jake looked at Sarah, who was wiping tears of happiness from her eyes, and felt his own heart skip several beats as he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was part of something bigger than himself, something that included not just the land he'd inherited but the family he'd chosen and the future they would build together. "We'll both be here," he promised his daughter. "We'll both be waiting for you to come home." After they said goodbye and hung up the phone, Jake and Sarah stood in the kitchen of the house where 4 generations of Morrisons had lived and worked and dreamed, holding each other and marveling at the strange series of events that had brought them back together after 20 years of separation. Outside, the Montana landscape stretched endlessly under a sky so blue it seemed infinite, and inside, 3 people who had once thought they'd lost each other forever were finally ready to discover what forever might actually mean. 2 years later, Jake Morrison stood in the same barn where Sarah had first told him about Emma, but this time he wasn't alone with shocking revelations and shattered certainties. This time, the barn was filled with 3 generations of family and friends who had gathered to celebrate something that would have seemed impossible just 24 months earlier. Emma Morrison Chen, now 20 years old and in her junior year studying sustainable ranch management, stood radiant in a simple white dress as she prepared to walk her father down the aisle at Jake and Sarah's wedding. The barn had been transformed with white lights strung between the rafters and wildflowers that Emma had picked from the meadows where her grandfather had once grazed cattle, but the most beautiful transformation was in the faces of the 3 people who had found their way back to each other against all odds. "Are you nervous, Dad?" Emma asked as she adjusted Jake's tie, her eyes sparkling with the joy that had become her constant expression since her parents had announced their engagement 6 months earlier. Jake looked across the barn to where Sarah was putting the finishing touches on her appearance with help from Miguel's wife Maria, who had become like a sister to her since her return to Montana. Sarah had chosen to wear her grandmother's wedding dress, a simple but elegant design that had been carefully preserved and altered to fit her perfectly. She looked more beautiful than she had at 18, more beautiful than Jake's memory had been able to capture during the 20 years they'd been apart. Terrified, Jake admitted to his daughter with a grin.
But, not about marrying your mother. About whether I deserve the happiness I'm feeling right now.
Emma laughed, a sound that never failed to make Jake's heart swell with pride and gratitude. Dad, you spent 40 years taking care of everyone and everything around you. You deserve all the happiness in the world. The past 2 years had been a revelation in ways Jake never could have anticipated. Watching Sarah rebuild her life in Montana had been like watching a flower bloom in fast motion, as she established a thriving veterinary practice that served ranchers throughout the valley and slowly reconnected with the community she'd left behind decades earlier. But, more than that, watching Sarah and Emma build their relationship as mother and adult daughter had given Jake a front-row seat to the healing of wounds he'd never fully understood. Emma had forgiven her mother with the generous heart of someone who had never known what it felt like to be unwanted or unloved, even though she'd grown up without a father. Sarah had thrown herself into making up for lost time with the intensity she brought to everything important in her life, and the result had been a mother-daughter bond that was both deeply affectionate and refreshingly honest. I still can't believe she kept you a secret for 18 years, Jake had said to Emma during one of their weekly phone calls while she was at school. She was protecting all of us the only way she knew how, Emma had replied with the wisdom that sometimes made Jake forget she was barely 20 years old. She was 18 and scared and thought she was doing what was best. We can spend the rest of our lives being angry about the time we lost, or we can spend the rest of our lives being grateful for the time we have. Emma had chosen gratitude, and her example had helped Jake and Sarah do the same. The ranch had flourished under their combined efforts in ways that seemed almost magical. Sarah's veterinary expertise had improved the health and productivity of their cattle, while Emma's university studies had introduced innovative management techniques that increased efficiency while protecting the environmental integrity that was becoming increasingly important to their industry. Jake had discovered that sharing the responsibilities he'd carried alone for so long didn't diminish his connection to the land, it deepened it. More importantly, the three of them had become a family in the truest sense of the word, not just people related by blood or affection but people committed to building a life together that honored their past while embracing their future. Places, everyone, called Pastor Mackenzie, the same minister who had officiated at Jake's parents' wedding 45 years earlier. The small congregation of friends and family members took their seats on hay bales that had been arranged in neat rows facing the makeshift altar where Jake's grandparents' wedding photo held the place of honor. Jake's parents had flown in from Arizona, their faces glowing with the happiness of people who had finally seen their only son find the love and family they'd always wanted for him. Sarah's parents, who had driven over from Missoula, sat with tears of joy streaming down their faces as they watched their daughter prepare to marry the man they'd always secretly hoped she would find her way back to. Miguel stood as Jake's best man, resplendent in his best suit and wearing a smile that threatened to split his weathered face. Maria served as Sarah's matron of honor, having become the sister Sarah had never had during the months they'd worked together to plan this celebration. But it was Emma who stole the show as she walked her father down the aisle, her arm linked through his as she prepared to give him away to the woman who had already given him the greatest gift of his life simply by bringing Emma into existence. "I love you, Dad," Emma whispered as they reached the altar and she prepared to take her seat in the front row. "I love you too, sweetheart," Jake whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing us all together. Thank you for being everything I imagined my father would be and more than I ever dared to hope for." Jake took his place at the altar and watched Sarah walk toward him with the same graceful confidence she'd displayed throughout their second courtship, but this time there was no uncertainty in her steps, no question about whether she was making the right choice. She was coming home in every sense of the word, and her face radiated the peace of someone who had finally stopped running from the life she was meant to live. When she reached him, Jake took her hands and felt his heart skip the same beats it had skipped that day in the barn when she'd first told him about Emma. But this time, the skipping came from joy rather than shock, from the overwhelming gratitude of a man who had been given a second chance at everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. Pastor Mackenzie began the ceremony with words about love and commitment, about the courage it took to build a life with another person, about the faith required to believe that two imperfect people could create something beautiful together. But Jake barely heard the formal words because he was too busy marveling at the reality of what was happening. He was marrying Sarah Chen, the love of his life, in the presence of their daughter and their chosen family, in the barn where their story had both ended and begun, on the land that had sustained his family for 4 generations and would now sustain the family they were creating together. When it came time for vows, Jake spoke from his heart rather than from prepared remarks, his voice carrying across the barn with the sincerity of someone who had learned the difference between promises made in passion and commitments made in wisdom. Sarah, 20 years ago we thought love meant never having to choose between the person you care about and the life you want to live. We've learned that real love means choosing to build a life together, choosing each other every day even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of my life, to build something beautiful with you, to honor the gift of our daughter and the miracle of our second chance. Sarah's vows were equally simple and equally profound, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Jake, I spent 20 years running away from this place because I thought staying meant giving up my dreams. I've learned that the biggest dream I ever had was to build a life with someone who understood that love isn't about finding someone who completes you, it's about finding someone you want to complete yourself with. I choose you, I choose this life, I choose our family, today and every day. When Pastor Mackenzie pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle and sweet, full of promise and gratitude rather than passion and desperation. It was the kiss of two people who had found their way home to each other and intended to stay. The reception was held in the main house, with dinner served on tables borrowed from the church and music provided by Emma on her guitar and a small band of local musicians who had known both Jake and Sarah since they were children. The evening was filled with laughter, dancing, and stories shared by people who had watched this unlikely reunion unfold over the past 2 years. But the most memorable moment came when Emma stood to give a toast to her parents, her young face serious as she looked out over the gathering of family and friends. 2 years ago, I was a college freshman with a lot of questions about where I came from and where I belonged, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. I had a mom who loved me and a future that looked pretty good, but I felt like something was missing, like there was a piece of my story that I couldn't access. She paused to look at Jake and Sarah, who were holding hands and hanging on every word. Then, Mom drove me to Montana to meet my dad, and I discovered that the missing piece wasn't just about me. It was about all three of us. We were all incomplete without each other, all carrying around empty spaces that could only be filled when we came together as a family. Emma raised her glass, and everyone in the room followed suit. So here's to second chances, to the courage to go home again, and to the love that's strong enough to wait 20 years and wise enough to recognize itself when it finally comes back. Here's to my parents, Jake and Sarah Morrison, who proved that some stories don't end, they just wait for the right time to begin their next chapter. The toast was met with cheers and applause that seemed to shake the rafters of the old house, and Jake felt his heart skip one more time as he realized that the story Emma was talking about was his story, their story, the story that had begun with young love and heartbreak and had somehow found its way to this moment of absolute completeness. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and Emma headed back to her apartment near the university campus, Jake and Sarah stood on the front porch of the house that was now officially their home, looking out over the land that would be their shared legacy and Emma's inheritance. "Do you think we're going to make it?" Sarah asked, leaning into Jake's warmth as the Montana wind whispered through the trees that Jake's great-grandfather had planted a century earlier. "I think we already made it," Jake replied, wrapping his arms around his wife and marveling at how natural the word felt. "We made it through 20 years apart and found our way back to each other. We made it through the fear and the uncertainty and the complicated business of figuring out how to be a family when none of us had any practice at it. Whatever comes next, we'll make it through that too." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Thank you for the best day of my life. I love you both. P.S. I'm thinking about bringing someone home for Thanksgiving. A boy from my agricultural economics class. Just so you know." Zoxo Jake showed the text to